Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 549. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone, and today is February 26th, 2024. We have a lot of news on today's show. The bulk of the show today will be about the war in Gaza, some of the developments going on, but particularly I want to focus in on the aid situation and all the different ways that Tel Aviv is restricting aid from getting into Gaza and the impacts it's having on aid shipments and then the impacts on the civilians of Gaza, which is absolutely horrific. So I think today will be a very important show. Share it out if you can. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. You can find the show at YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee if you want to watch the video version. All the articles I talk about, we display occasionally maps, photos that help the articles. Also got, some video feed of myself and when he's on, co-host Connor Freeman when we are here. So there's that as well. If you like watching stuff, check that out. Wherever you're watching, be sure you're subscribed to the show. And if that platform has the feature, hit the alarm bell so you get the notification. Twitter now has that. So even on my Twitter handle at @KyleAnzalone_, you can hit the alarm bell. That way, all the articles I write, all the podcasts I put out, you're seeing them right away. And for everybody who's been retweeting and putting my stuff out there, I know I see it a lot more, especially just when I'm scrolling through Twitter now. A lot more people are sharing out the show, and I really appreciate it when you all do that. It's really helped to boost the audience numbers over the past couple months, and notice a lot more interaction, not just on the videos, but also on Twitter and other platforms. So again, thank you all so much for doing that and interacting, and let's get into the news for today's show. First story up here, the headline just, makes me chuckle a little bit. Biden calls Putin crazy SOB. And this just sounds so much like something that Biden would say, just kind of off the cuff, not really thinking a whole lot. But the rest of his remarks here are actually really wild. So this is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. President Biden called Russian President Vladimir Putin a crazy SOB during a campaign fundraising event on Wednesday, drawing a rebuke from the Kremlin. Biden made the jab at the Russian leader after discussing climate change, claiming it was a bigger threat than nuclear war. We have a crazy SOB, that guy Putin, and others. We always had to be worried about a nuclear conflict, but the existential threat to humanity is climate. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov responded to Biden's comments, saying it brought shame to the U.S. and it was a Hollywood cowboy behavior aimed at a domestic audience. And I mean, that sounds right on the button to me, that this is kind of what Biden thought, that, this is president in a leather jacket who wears the aviators. He takes them off and he says bold things and talks, tough to our enemies and things like that. This is kind of, I think, the character that Biden thinks he is in his brain when it's functioning. So I think that's accurate. The way Putin responded to it, I do think that, he kind of took it this way too, which is good that it's not, more personal and things like that. But, at the same time, it's problematic. It's just like when he calls Xi a dictator right after he met with him. Is it going to destroy the U.S.-Russia relationship? No. Are the Russians going to have to look the other way on this and do their best to ignore it? Yes. Is it still damaging somewhat and, kind of set back the U.S. reputation and just make us look stupid? Yes. So Peskov, the Russian spokesperson, went on to say, such bold statements from the mouth of a U.S. leader are hardly compatible of hurting the head of another country in any way, much less President Putin, but it brings great shame for the country itself. Putin said the insult was likely a response to the Russian leader saying Biden was preferable to Trump from a Russian perspective since Biden is more predictable. We understand what is going on there in terms of domestic policy and it's completely appropriate reaction, which means I was right. And so what Putin is saying, that Biden has to make himself look anti-Putin, and this is the predictable policy that Putin is talking about. And so rather than embracing that Putin said Biden would be a better president, which would be, a politically unpredictable move, Biden instead fires back and calls Putin an SOB. And so that's kind of the predictable thing, which is, if Putin says something nice about Biden, Biden has to come back and say something twice as mean about Putin just to make it so nobody could ever question the whole Russiagate narrative that's been established in the U.S. Biden has abandoned diplomacy with Putin and hasn't spoken to the Russian leader since Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. That was now past 2 years ago. The U.S. has cut most of high-level diplomatic contacts with Russia and continues to reject the idea of negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. Biden has a history of hurling insults at the Russian leader and referred to Putin as a killer back in 2021. The president also recently referred to Xi as a dictator following a meeting with him meant to ease tensions between the U.S. and China. And one more thing I'll bring up here, and actually, for people who don't know, which I can't imagine you don't, but Dave DeCamp, who writes a lot of these fantastic articles, who is the news editor at antiwar.com, has a show of his own, antiwar.com news with Dave DeCamp. And, he breaks down a lot of this as well. And on his show, he pointed out that this is a really wild statement for Biden to make, because over a year ago, he said that the nuclear tensions between the U.S. and Russia were higher than at any point since or as high as the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so the fact that we've been at these level of nuclear tensions with Russia for over a year now, and Biden doesn't see that as the biggest threat that he has to deal with, it is really quite concerning. All right, next up here, this one I wrote for antiwar.com on February 25th. NATO chief gives Ukraine green light for attack inside Russia. So NATO Secretary General, this is Jens Stoltenberg, said Ukraine has a right to hit Russian military targets outside of Ukraine. The remarks were made as members of the North Atlantic Alliance are preparing to send Kiev weapons with longer ranges. The Kremlin has explained that it will claim more Ukrainian territory to offset the threat presented by long-range arms. So Stoltenberg told Radio Free Press on Tuesday, so this was last week, Ukraine has a right to self-defense, and that includes also striking legitimate military targets, Russian military targets outside of Ukraine. That is international law, of course. Ukraine has a right to do so to protect itself. This is the first time the NATO chief has endorsed Ukrainian attacks inside of Russia. And so a couple things here. And as I've said throughout this war, it's not that there's some particular reason I don't think Ukraine should carry out attacks inside of Russia. This is something that I talked about with the war in Yemen, where when the Houthis were carrying out attacks inside of Saudi Arabia, this is something that the Houthis are able to do. Now, there are consequences and repercussions to this for Ukraine that we'll get into. Russia tends to step up attacks on Ukrainian cities in response to attacks inside of Russia. However, the reason I find this particularly problematic is, of course, Ukraine is waging a proxy war on behalf of the West against Russia. You have congressmen like former congressman like Adam Kinzinger, who, was in office and helped to establish this policy when it was initially put in place, this proxy war, celebrating that there's 400,000 dead, or he estimates that there's 400,000 dead Russians over the past 2 years. And this is a victory in the eyes of the West. And so carrying out these attacks within Russia is going to be viewed in the Kremlin as essentially Western attacks on Russia. And of course, Russia has tolerated quite a bit of this so far and has escalated the war in Ukraine in response, but hasn't necessarily started carrying out attacks inside of NATO countries. However, it doesn't mean that cannot happen. And so I mentioned here in my article, after Russia invaded Ukraine 2 years ago, the U.S. and its allies began massive weapon shipments to Kiev. However, the Western arms shipments were limited to shorter range munitions in an effort not to provoke a massive war with Russia. Over time, the concerns that Moscow will escalate to direct war with NATO over Ukraine has lessened, and the White House has provided Ukraine with more advanced weapon systems. Several NATO members are working to transfer training Ukrainian pilots on F-16s, then plan to transfer dozens of the advanced American-made fighter jets to Kiev. Stoltenberg did acknowledge that the alliance members placed restrictions on arms sent to Ukraine, but said that others did not. He didn't specify what countries were putting what restrictions on. The F-16s are scheduled to arrive in Ukraine later this year, but that delivery has been delayed several times, and it's unclear if there's going to be any restrictions on what Ukraine could do with the F-16s. At the start of the war, President Joe Biden was only willing to sign off on munitions with a range of 50 miles. Over the course of the war, European nations began transferring cruise missiles to Ukraine with a range of 150 miles, and these are the Taurus cruise missiles. I believe both France and Germany have sent these to Ukraine. The White House has sent Kiev rockets with a range of 100 miles, considering sending missiles with a range of 200 miles if Congress approves another round of funding for the war. Russian forces are advancing in eastern Ukraine as Kiev loses more territory and struggles to find the men and arms to fight Moscow's forces on the front lines. Ukraine is launching more attacks inside of Russia. The Kremlin responds to those attacks by attacking Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. And for people who want a little bit more analysis on this particular part of the war that's going on, Judge Andrew Napolitano had Matthew Ho on his show last week. He has Matt on his show, I think, pretty much every week. So you'll have to go to, particularly last week's interview. I think it was towards the end of last week, maybe Wednesday or Thursday. And what Ho explains to the judge is that this is a really awful phase of the war that we're entering into now, where the Russian forces are taking more territory on the ground. But a lot of what's going on in this war now is tit for tat attacks on each other's cities. And this gets very bloody and very damaging and can really escalate things very quickly. All right, next up here, we mentioned this was going to happen on the show last week, and now we are seeing this play out. This is from Dave DeCamp, February 22nd at antiwar.com. U.S. congressional delegation led by House's top China hawk visits Taiwan. So a congressional delegation led by Representative Mike Gallagher, he's a Republican from Wisconsin, and the chair of the House's China Committee arrived in Taiwan on Thursday to show bipartisan support for Lai Ching-te, Taiwan's vice president, who won elections in January and will be sworn in as president in May. After arriving in Taiwan, Gallagher took a shot at China in a statement released by the House China Committee, formerly known as the Select Committee on Chinese Communist Party. Time and again, Taiwan has shown how the world can stand up to the CCP's bullying and not only survive but thrive. We are thrilled to be in Taipei and to show our support for our friends in Taiwan. President-elect Lai and the newly elected legislative Yuan, the United States stands with Taiwan. Gallagher said his delegation will be in Taiwan from the 22nd to the 24th. They will be meeting with the Taiwanese president on Thursday, who thanked the U.S. lawmakers for issuing statements congratulating Lai on his victory in January. Both Tai and Lai are members of the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, which is independence leading and wants stronger ties with the West. China strongly opposed any contacts between U.S. and Taiwanese officials, with the Chinese Foreign Ministry affirmed when asked about Gallagher's visit. Taiwan is an inalienable part of Chinese territory. China opposes any form of official interaction between the U.S. and Taiwan authorities and rejects the U.S. interference in Taiwan affairs in whatever form, under whatever pretext. Lai has been denounced by Beijing as a dangerous separatist and is expected to continue moving Taiwan closer to the U.S., following the pattern of Tai's 8 years in office. However, members of the opposition Kuomintang Party, which seek to ease tensions with the mainland, won the speakership in the Taiwanese legislature, making it hard for the DPP to get legislation made into law. During his time as the head of the China Committee, which was formed last year, Gallagher has urged the U.S. to arm Taiwan to the teeth and increase diplomatic backing for Taiwan. Like other China hawks, he frames these steps as deterrents, but the increase in U.S. support has only escalated tensions in the region, making conflict more likely. Unfortunately, China hasn't responded to this the same way they responded to the visit by Nancy Pelosi. And of course, Gallagher isn't quite as high of a ranking member of Congress, but, there is, the U.S. gives significant support to China, and China has stepped up operations around Taiwan, military drills and things like that over the past week or so. All right, next up here. We're getting into the Israel section of the show now from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. 14 billion U.S. aid package for Israel created to prepare for multi-front war, not just Gaza. The 14 billion in additional military aid for Israel that President Biden is seeking was not designed for just operations in Gaza, but prepare Israel for a multi-front war, the Times of Israel has reported. A senior Biden administration official told the Jewish Telegraphic Agency that the 14 billion is for Israel to defend itself in a multi-front war and to be sure it can deter a multi-front war. Israel has been escalating airstrikes in Lebanon against Hezbollah, though many of those strikes have killed civilians. The fire across the border risks a full-blown war, and there have been no signs tensions will ease anytime soon. Israeli officials have been threatening to invade if Hezbollah doesn't move back from the Israeli-Lebanon border. U.S. officials have acknowledged to the Washington Post that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu might view a war in Lebanon as key to his political survival, as polling has shown Israelis want him to step down after the current conflict. Israel also appears attempting to provoke Iran, as several members of Iran's IRGC have been killed by Israeli airstrikes in Syria since October 7th. According to the New York Times, Israel was also behind a covert attack on 2 natural gas pipelines in Iran. But the $14 billion is packed into the $95 billion foreign military aid bill that was passed through the Senate but has not yet been brought to the House floor, as Republicans are looking for a border deal. The legislation also includes about $60 billion for Ukraine and $4.8 billion for Taiwan and other spending in the Asia Pacific. The $14 billion for Israel is on top of the $3.8 billion the country receives from the U.S. each year. According to the Times of Israel, it includes $5.2 billion to go towards Israeli missile defense, which has been seen as a critical necessity for the war with Hezbollah. Another $3.5 billion will replenish the Israeli munitions used in Gaza. The U.S. will use $4 billion U.S. to refill its own stockpiles, including contingency stockpiles located in Israel that the Israeli military has been allowed to use for its operations in Gaza. And this particular chunk of money is interesting because this suggests that the Biden administration has been transferring Israel weapons at the U.S. expense. So not selling weapons to Israel, but transferring weapons to Israel, and has now needs to fill its own stockpiles to replenish the weapons sent to Israel, which would mean that there wasn't necessarily congressional funding for these weapons in the first place. Now, this is something that, again, I'll go back to Judge Andrew Napolitano and what he has talked about on his show several times, that Secretary of State Antony Blinken is likely in violation of the law when he is signing these statements that says the U.S. needs to emergency transfer military assistance to Israel. And, I had assumed that they were just emergency military cells, so they're bypassing Congress, but Israel is at least paying for the weapons. But now I'm starting to think that these are just, transfers, giveaways of American arms to Israel, and the Biden administration is worrying about the cost and paying for that later, but for now they're just going to send the American weapons abroad, even without the congressional funding to do so. All right, this one from Dave DeCamp, February 25th at antiwar.com. U.S. airman sets himself on fire in front of Israeli embassy to protest Gaza genocide. So an active duty U.S. airman set himself on fire in front of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. to protest the U.S.-backed slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. According to Axios, a video of the incident shows the airman, who has now been publicly identified, but wasn't at the time that Dave wrote this article. His name is Aaron Bushnell, 25 years old, or was 25 years old. He succumbed to his injuries after setting himself on fire here. The video is quite hard to watch. I would not recommend it. There are variations of the video on Ets in particular, where you could listen to him give his statement and the reason he's going to go through with setting himself on fire. He says he can no longer be complicit in genocide and it's an act of protest. But compared to what the people have been experiencing in Palestine at the hands of the colonizers, it's not extreme at all. This is what our ruling class has decided to be normal, the airman said right before he set himself on fire. And so again, there is a video where they blur out once he sets himself on fire. That way it's not quite so graphic. But, this is just an awful situation overall. Once he's on fire, he repeatedly shouted, "Free Palestine." He burned for about a minute before law enforcement officers extinguished the flames. And while one officer was extinguishing his flames, another officer initially drew his gun on the airman as he burned. Washington, D.C.'s Fire and Emergency Medical Services said on a post on X that the airman was transported to the hospital with critical life-threatening injuries. And again, we now know he has since died of those injuries. I've seen some people who are apparently friends of Bushnell, the airman, come out and say that he was somebody who was mentally healthy, who was physically healthy, so this wasn't somebody who was maybe, say, suffering from a severe mental illness, something with psychosis, who lit himself on fire, but rather somebody who just couldn't, had maybe so much moral injury, so much loss of confidence in what he was, set out to do with his life, be a U.S. airman, that he decided to take these steps. So a truly awful situation there. Hopefully it made some impact on the U.S. and Israeli policy, but I really don't think it will. The Israeli government, one of their official Twitter accounts, tweeted out, kind of mocking the U.S. airmen, saying it's good when Israeli enemies kill themselves. So quite disturbing, the Israeli take on this too. All right, next up here, this one I wrote for the antiwar.com on February 23rd. U.S. intel has low confidence in Israeli claims. A dozen UN staff participate in Hamas attack. So the U.S. and several other Western countries cut funding to the UN Relief and Works Agency, that's UNRWA, after Israel claimed that several members of the organization participated in the Hamas attack on October 7th. The U.S. Intelligence Community has low confidence in the veracity of the Israeli assertions. The Washington Post reports having evidence of a single UNRWA member in Israel on October 7th. In January, Tel Aviv began circulating the claim that 12 members of UNRWA attacked Israel on October 7th and that scores of other members have ties to Hamas. The release of the claims was timed with the International Court of Justice ruling that Israel was plausibly committing a genocide in Gaza, so pretty clearly a propaganda move. Earlier this month, Tel Aviv released a summary of its intelligence for the assertions to several news outlets. After reviewing the Israeli dossier, multiple news outlets report that Israel had provided no evidence to back the claim that members of UNRWA were aligned with Hamas. Still, Washington and several other top donors to UNRWA backed Tel Aviv's allegations and cut funding to the agency. Secretary of State Antony Blinken referred to the claims as highly, highly credible. UNRWA, the most crucial aid organization to deliver aid in Gaza and prevent the famine from getting worse. In Gaza, 1 in 6 children is on the verge of starvation. The government in Tel Aviv maintains significant power and oversight over UNRWA. The organization provides Israel with a list of all of its employees annually, and Tel Aviv can demand that UNRWA sever ties with any of its staff. On Wednesday, the Wall Street Journal reported that U.S. intelligence assessment that concluded it had low confidence in the Israeli claims. The intel assessment did not dispute all Israeli claims, but according to the Wall Street Journal, it provided more measured appraisal of Israel's assertions than public statements by U.S. and Israeli officials. Last week, the Washington Post reported obtaining a video that showed one UNRWA social worker in southern Israel on October 7th who was seen loading the body of an Israeli into a vehicle. The Post reports matching the photos from social media to the UNRWA staff member and his vehicle to CCTV footage from southern Israel. So Assuming the CCTV footage is authentic, it does seem like a pretty solid report on behalf of the Washington Post here that this, at least one member of UNRWA was in southern Israel on October 7th. They have a couple kind of specific things that, this guy has posted pictures of himself in his car on social media. And then if you look at the video on October 7th, there's a few details with the car. The cover on the replacement tire is identical. There's a couple other like kind of pieces of trim on the car that are identical, that are not, a standard model of the vehicle, right? And so it does appear that this one particular man was in Israel on October 7th. However, this falls far short of what Israel's claims were, and the fact that one member of an organization with 30,000 people would have participated in some kind of crime is absolutely meaningless. A dozen, say that a dozen members of a company like Delta participated in some kind of crime, I think most people would dismiss that Delta was somehow responsible or was somehow like a fertile environment for some kind of bad people, right? But this is far less. This is only one, right? So this is like one employee of Delta committing some crime. To then point to Delta and say that they're somehow responsible is absolutely absurd and stupid. So while Washington often accepts all of Israeli claims of crimes committed by Palestinians, and the White House ignores well-documented crimes of Israeli war crimes in Gaza. Recently, the UN found several credible reports of Israeli forces committing rampant executions and sexual violence against women and girls. The Biden administration has claimed that it must support Israel because of the alleged sexual crimes of Hamas, but will not curb support for weapon shipments to Tel Aviv when Israeli forces are reported committing similar offenses. Next up here, U.S. officials warn Israeli disruptions to aid is turning Gaza into Mogadishu. So I wrote this on February 25th for antiwar.com. The White House has asked the Israeli government to end attacks on police in Gaza. Targeting the civilian police force has caused more chaos in the Strip and has made aid distributions nearly impossible. U.S. officials believe that Israeli actions to prevent aid deliveries in Gaza are creating humanitarian crisis, similar to the situation that once existed in Mogadishu. Axios reported speaking with American and Israeli officials who said that Washington has asked Tel Aviv to stop targeting the police force in Gaza. The police force was working with international aid groups to distribute aid in the Strip. As almost all of the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza are struggling to find food to eat, aid convoys have been mobbed and prevented from reaching their destinations. The police force has halted the escorts after Israeli forces began targeting the police. Tel Aviv has taken several other steps to restrict aid deliveries into Gaza. The Israeli finance minister, that's Bezalel Smotrich, is preventing the distribution of U.S.-funded aid shipments into the Strip. The Israeli government has also installed an onerous inspections regime for all aid entering Gaza. The inspections remove life-saving medication from shipments and create bottlenecks that slow delivery. Additionally, Israeli security forces are allowing Israeli civilian protesters to block aid deliveries at the border crossing, further delaying shipments. Even if aid enters the Strip, Israeli forces have attacked the trucks. And recently there was one that was well documented by CNN. Prior to the Israeli assault on Gaza, 500 aid trucks entered the Strip daily to help support the besieged population. Since the Israeli onslaught began, Tel Aviv has barred commercial shipments and limited aid to just a fraction of the pre-war levels. My understanding, and this is from UN official statements, that the most aid trucks that have entered Israel on any single day since October 7th is about 230, which is under half of the shipment before. And think about that. The number of Palestinian civilians relying on aid to survive has skyrocketed since that time. Tens of thousands of civilians have been injured in Israeli attacks. Virtually all Palestinians living in Gaza are internally displaced. Just about every medical facility has been destroyed. 1 in 6 children in northern Gaza are estimated to be on the brink of starvation. Many Palestinians have resorted to eating grass, rotting food, or animal feed. A 2-month-old Palestinian child starved to death in central Gaza on Friday. And so given those conditions, you obviously need a lot more aid going into Gaza than pre-war, but you actually have less. And while 230 is the most trucks that have reached Gaza in any single day since October 7th. The UN and other aid officials report that over the past month, aid shipments have almost been cut in half. So I think it was about 200 a day, and the numbers have been like the 90s or 100s most days throughout February. So that's been a real setback for the Palestinians. All right, Israel hinders humanitarian assistance in Gaza by delaying visas for aid workers. Oh, and on that last article, the U.S. officials said that they were concerned it would turn, the situation would be similar to the one that once plagued Somalia's capital, Mogadishu. I'm assuming they're referring to the period after the U.S.-backed Ethiopian invasion of Somalia that crushed the Islamic Courts Union, the Somali government, and plunged the country into chaos at a time that there was a famine going on in the Horn of Africa as well. And you had, I think, 250,000 people drop dead in that time. Really horrific situation. So definitely don't want that replicated. All right, next up here. Israel hinders humanitarian assistance in Gaza by delaying visas for aid workers. So this is kind of a part 2 of that article as far as Israel limiting aid shipments and hurting the aid delivery in Gaza and the West Bank here. So Israel using bureaucratic red tape to delay the entry of aid workers into the West Bank and Gaza. The policy has led to fewer humanitarian aid workers providing services to the Palestinians, as many children are on the brink of starvation. According to Haaretz, the Population Immigration Authority is refusing to grant visas for employees of international aid organizations that operate in Gaza and the West Bank. Officials in Tel Aviv claim they have not issued the visas due to bureaucratic rearrangement. However, aid workers told Haaretz they believe the denials are politically motivated. The Israeli outlet reports that, as well as not approving new visas, is refusing to extend visas for workers who are already in Gaza and the West Bank. The lack of workers has disrupted the activities of several aid organizations operating in the Strip. And so, I guess, during COVID, my understanding is that Israel, while they didn't process any new visas for aid workers in the West Bank and Gaza, they did extend the visas for the aid workers that are already there. This time, they're not doing that, so it was actually really hurting the staffing of these agencies. Tel Aviv has taken several steps to block or slow aid transfers to Gaza. The Israeli onslaught in Gaza has created a humanitarian crisis that American officials have compared to the horrific situation that once plagued Somalia's capital, Mogadishu. Children in Gaza have starved to death, including a 2-month-old boy who died on Friday. In addition to hindering aid operations in Gaza, the visa restrictions have also impacted international organizations that assist Palestinians in the West Bank. After Israel began its onslaught in Gaza, Tel Aviv has stepped up military raids in the West Bank. The Israeli raids in the West Bank have resulted in thousands of arrests. Many Palestinians are detained without charges. Additionally, Israeli forces have often stood by while Israeli settlers in the West Bank have killed, harassed, and chased Palestinians from their home. Nearly 400 Palestinians in the West Bank have been killed by Israeli forces over the past 4.5 months, including over 100 children. I guess just a little bit of addendum to that last sentence. Some of the 400 Palestinians that have been killed in the West Bank were killed by settlers, not just the Israeli forces, the IDF. All right, next up here, Doctors Without Borders slams U.S. for vetoing Gaza ceasefire resolution. So last week, I read a pretty long statement from the U.S. Executive Director of Doctors Without Borders, who I think that Ashley Benoit, who went through and kind of detailed the horrific situation in Gaza and what's going on there. Well, this is a statement from the Medical Sans Frontiers leader. So this is, I guess, the French leader of the group, who gave this statement. We are appalled by the willingness of the United States to use its powers as a permanent council member to obstruct efforts to adopt a most evident of resolutions, one demanding an immediate and sustained ceasefire. 3 times this council has had an opportunity to vote for the ceasefire that is so desperately needed, and 3 times the United States has used its veto power. A draft resolution by the United States ostensibly calls for a ceasefire. However, this is misleading at best. The resolution that's being drafted by the U.S. calls for a temporary ceasefire if the Israeli hostages are released. So yeah, misleading at best. All right, next up here, Netanyahu's post-war plans for Gaza call for military occupation without time limit. I wrote this one for antiwar.com on February 23rd. Israel has released its first draft plans for post-war Gaza. Throughout the 4 months of brutal onslaught, Israeli forces have decimated the Strip and killed 30,000 Palestinians. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's post-war plans call for operational freedom of action in the entire Gaza Strip without time limit and demilitarization of Palestinians. The Israeli government first released the document to some media outlets on Thursday. According to the translation from NBC News, the document says Israel will maintain its operational freedom action on the entire Gaza Strip without time limit. And so this essentially means an enduring military occupation of Gaza. Now, maybe those Israeli soldiers will be stationed on bases in the demilitarized zones of the Gaza Strip. They're going to establish no-go zones, or Palestinians aren't allowed to be. All these new buffer zones and things like that throughout Gaza. And this is just according to the plan. They could chase all the Palestinians out or kill all the Palestinians before this even comes to fruition. But this should be very concerning and a big red light to people that this is what Israel is willing to say they're going to do. Additionally, the plan calls for the security perimeter being created in the Gaza Strip on the border with Israel will remain as long as there is a security for it. Israel is also requesting border control between Egypt and Gaza. Netanyahu's plan may face resistance in Washington and Cairo. Egypt has demanded that Israel deploy its forces along the border. The U.S. has asked Israel not to expand buffer zones in Gaza. However, Tel Aviv has ignored nearly all of Washington's requests over the past 4 months, with no impact on U.S. aid shipments to Israel. Netanyahu says he will not allow the rebuilding of the Strip to begin until Palestinians have been, quote, de-radicalized. Additionally, Tel Aviv plans to have complete control over the future political system in Gaza. And, so any candidate who comes, or any government that comes in Gaza, will have to be a party or from, an organization approved by Israel. Netanyahu said the Strip will be fully demilitarized. And so, obviously, if this was what one country was imposing on another country, the U.S. would be completely outraged. And in fact, I think far more seriously than, some of the demands that Russia laid out for Ukraine, especially now that we know that Ukrainians officials say Russia wasn't all that interested in denazification. But if you look at what Netanyahu is laying out here, he's essentially, imposing far, far stricter conditions on the Palestinians than Putin wanted the Ukrainians to agree to. And the U.S. is backing one and calling the other one a genocide. And, the one that's far worse is the one that we're backing. And the one that, has been measured war between two neighbors is the one that, the U.S. calls a genocide, an attempted genocide by the Russians, even though they've been willing to negotiate an end to that war that did not take any Ukrainian territory other than the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia annexed in 2014. So Netanyahu says he will not allow the rebuilding of the Strip. President Joe Biden has requested that Netanyahu allow Arab states to finance the reconstruction of Gaza and allow the Palestinian Authority to govern Gaza once the process of creating a sovereign Palestine. Netanyahu's proposal did not mention the PA. The Israeli government has repeatedly stated that it will not allow the Palestinian Authority to control Gaza or the Palestinians to ever have a state. In a statement released by the Israeli government, Netanyahu says Israel utterly rejects international dictates over final status agreement with the Palestinians. Netanyahu additionally plans to shut down UNRWA, the main aid agency for Gaza that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians rely on for survival. Tel Aviv recently accused UNRWA of employing 12 people who took part in the Hamas attack on Israel. However, the U.S. intelligence community assessment only endorsed the claim with low confidence. All right, new hostage deal is on the table. The U.S. presents new hostage deal. The U.S., Qatar, and Egypt have presented a potential new hostage agreement. The deal presented on Friday calls for Hamas to release 40 Israel captive, while Israel pauses fighting in Gaza for 6 weeks. The proposal also calls for Tel Aviv to allow Palestinians to return to the northern half of the Strip. On Saturday, Axios reported that CIA Director Bill Burns, the Qatari Prime Minister, and the the director of Egyptian intelligence participated in talks that led to the new agreement. Israeli and Hamas officials did not participate in the negotiation, and it is unclear if either side will find the terms acceptable. The deal is for Hamas to release 40 hostages, including some Israeli soldiers, and for Tel Aviv to release hundreds of Palestinian detainees. The agreement also calls for a 6-week pause in fighting and for Israel to allow Palestinians to return to the northern half of the Strip. Now, all right, so a few problems with this proposal. One, doesn't actually have an end to the fighting in Gaza, which I think is necessary. Two, the number of Palestinian detainees being released is in the hundreds, and people might say, well, you're releasing 40 Israeli hostages, so if you're releasing hundreds of Palestinians, then there's a disparity there. This would make sense. However, you have to remember that since October 7th, Israel has arrested thousands of Palestinians, including many just under administrative detention. So these people aren't accused of committing any crimes, not even taking part of any political actions or protests or anything like that. We covered the case of a Palestinian human rights lawyer, a 28-year-old girl who was arrested and placed under administrative detention at a checkpoint in the West Bank. She's going to be in jail for at least 4 months. And so this is happening time and time again. And so if you want to release all the hostages that have been taken since October 7th, you have to include the thousands of Palestinians in that group, and not just, a few hundred of them to make this comparable release. Additionally, if the U.S. wants Palestinians to return to the northern half of the Strip, it's going to have Israel start delivering aid to that portion of Gaza, which is just refusing to do at this point. The last aid truck that tried to make it into northern Gaza was attacked by Israel. And, there's all these problems like Israel attacking the police force in Gaza that won't allow the aid to be shipped that far in the Strip. So a U.S. official speaking with Axios about the deal said some progress was made without providing an explanation. And this is, I saw in Western media time and time again, they're saying progress. I think this is solely pro-Israeli propaganda. I don't think there has been any progress made towards a hostage release deal. I think basically what the Israeli government at least is trying to do is drag the U.S. people along here, make them think, the Israelis are going to come to some kind of agreement. They're not going to slaughter all the Palestinians in Gaza. They're not going to attack Rafah yet. So it's not going to be that bad. And it is, and they're going to attack Rafah. They're saying so. They're not going to agree to a deal, but, stringing the progress along, is kind of the cover that the U.S. has used to continue to provide aid to Israel, to continue to veto these UN Security Council resolutions. The last time it was vetoed, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, said this is going to get in the way of the hostage deal the Americans are working on, which is just a ridiculous lie. But if you're not having some progress in that hostage deal and you keep vetoing the UN Security Council resolutions, then, you're just killing any potential ceasefire. And this gives them that propaganda cover to make those statements, even though they're lies. So Prime Minister Netanyahu explained that even if Israel agrees to a hostage deal, Israel will continue military operations in Gaza. We are working to get another framework for the release of our hostages, as well as the completion of the elimination of the Hamas battalions in Rafah, he said. Israel is threatening to attack the Gazan city Rafah that is sheltering 1.5 million Palestinians. Aid organizations have warned that an attack on the city will become a slaughter of the civilians if Israel moves forward with the planned operations. Benny Gantz, a member of the Israeli War Cabinet, threatened that the assault on Rafah will begin within weeks if Hamas doesn't release all the hostages. He made the deadline as Ramadan, which is March 10th, starting in 2 weeks here. In recent weeks, Israel has refused to engage in hostage talks. CNN reports speaking with officials who say that during upcoming talks, Tel Aviv will allow the Israeli negotiators to engage in discussions. Netanyahu has instructed the Israeli mediators to only listen at talks and not propose potential solutions. On Saturday, the Israeli leader said he will approve the attack on Rafah next week. And so what CNN was just explaining there was, in the past few weeks, the Israeli mediators at the talks have only sat there and listened and have not said, oh, well, we agree with this, but we don't agree with that. Maybe if we approach it this way rather than that way, we could come to some kind of resolution. None of that has been allowed. Now, Netanyahu, and I think this is the quote, progress, will just allow the Israeli mediators to express the Israeli position, but not necessarily that the Israeli mediators are going to do anything differently or propose anything that would be maybe more acceptable. All right, last story on Gaza here. Netanyahu says hostage deal will only delay attack on Rafah. So I think in a lot of ways this is Netanyahu signaling that this hostage deal that was just proposed by the White House is a non-starter and isn't going to go through, and you know, kind of threatening Hamas, don't even bother engaging with it because we're going to attack Rafah anyways. So President Netanyahu explained that if Tel Aviv agrees to a new hostage deal with Hamas, it will only delay the Israeli attack on Rafah. International aid organizations have warned that an attack on the city of 1.5 million will be devastating to the civilian population. On Friday, the U.S., Egypt, and Qatar presented a new hostage deal that would see the release of 40 Israeli captives in exchange for a 6-week pause in fighting. The deal was negotiated without the input of Tel Aviv or Hamas, and neither side has signed on to it. Hamas's top priority is ending the Israeli onslaught. Netanyahu's remarks signal Israel is unwilling to end the war until every city in Gaza is destroyed. Once we begin in the Rafah operations, the intense phase of the fighting is weeks away from completion, not months. If we don't have a deal, we'll do it anyways. From north to south, Israeli operations have systematically annihilated the Strip. The operations have killed over 30,000 Palestinians and driven 1.5 million to the southernmost city of Rafah. Aid organizations that operate in Gaza warn the assault on Rafah will be catastrophic as there is no place for the Palestinians to flee. This is from Avril Benoit, the executive director of Doctors Without Borders in the U.S. Rafah is the end of the line. There is nowhere else to flee. Even if the people are torn north, they will find no homes to go back to and supply lines for bringing food, water, and medicine or any other essentials. The consequences of a full-scale assault on Rafah are truly unimaginable, and we cannot stand and wait for this to unfold. The White House has asked Tel Aviv not to attack Rafah until a plan is in place for the Palestinians. However, Israel has routinely ignored U.S. requests throughout the war in Gaza. President Biden has refused to place conditions on U.S. support for Israel, and that, would be the conditions would be Tel Aviv applying with the U.S. demands. All right, a couple more stories on some other stuff going on in the Middle East here. Israeli defense minister, ceasefire in Gaza would mean escalation in Lebanon. What a statement. So, ongoing fighting in Lebanon, Israel border may get much worse, according to the Israeli defense minister Gallant. Commenting on the ongoing ceasefire talks and looking at least a temporary stop to the open-ended offensive in the Gaza Strip, Gallant said that Israel will increase the fire in the north independently if there was a pause. Interestingly, the only thing that was holding up Hezbollah in supporting their own ceasefire with Israel was the ongoing war in Gaza. If somehow that were to come to an end, the deal in the north should be much more possible, even if Israel sees it as a license to escalate. Gallant said the fighting will continue until Hezbollah is forced from the border and displaced. Israelis are able to return home in the north. He said Hezbollah isn't able to replace commanders that Israel has killed. This comes after an explosion on the Syrian side of the Syrian-Lebanon border left at least 3 Lebanon members dead and is widely expected to be the result of an Israeli airstrike against the paratroopers in the area. As is so often the case with daytime airstrikes, Israel issued no statement on the matter and is yet to take credit for it. Despite this, it is being reported that the troops were targeted on suspicion of smuggling weapons to Hezbollah. Saturday saw a flurry of Hezbollah missiles strike against northern Israel, and report from Hezbollah said that attacks targeted at least 6 military bases and other gatherings of Israeli military personnel. The Saturday missiles were near several Israeli towns along the border, though the Israeli military reports that most of those missiles have been either intercepted. Either that way, there were no reports of damage or injuries. All right. Couple stories on Yemen here. Yemen's Houthis hit another British-owned cargo ship. The Houthis struck another British-owned cargo ship on Thursday as the U.S. bombing campaign in Yemen is failing to deter the Houthi attacks that have only escalated the situation in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. U.S. Central Command said that 2 Houthi ballistic missiles fired into the Gulf of Aden impacted the MV Icelander, Palau-flagged ship, Palau-flagged UK-owned cargo carrier, causing 1 minor injury and damage. CENTCOM ship, the ship was able to continue on its voyage despite the damage. A day earlier, CENTCOM said U.S. aircraft and allied warship shot down 6 Houthi drones in the Red Sea. On Wednesday, the command said it launched 4 strikes against the Houthi-controlled Yemen and claimed the bomb destroyed 7 Houthi mobile anti-cruise missiles and 1 anti-ship ballistic missile launcher that were prepared to launch towards the Red Sea. The Icelander is the second British ship the Houthis have successfully targeted this week. They also hit the Ramyar, a bulk carrier, causing significant damage for the crew to abandon the ship. The Houthis have said the ship sank, but pictures of the vessel surfaced on Thursday showing it was down by the stern but still afloat. However, the operator said the ship could still sink and is being towed toward Djibouti. I do believe now they expect the ship to make it to Djibouti, but I'm not sure officially how much damage and if the ship will just have to be scrapped from there. Also, apparently it's leaking oil, which is causing some environmental concerns in the region. All right, next up here, U.S. officials surprised by Houthi military capabilities. Last article today, another one I wrote for antiwar.com on February 25th. Joe Biden administration officials admit that 6 weeks into the undeclared war in Yemen, the U.S. and U.K. strikes have failed to erode the Houthi military capabilities. The officials said the U.S. is surprised at the Houthis' military capabilities and that Washington has a limited understanding of how advanced their weapon systems are. On January 11th, President Biden ordered the first rounds of strikes in Yemen. The White House claimed the attack was designed to force the Houthi to end Israeli attacks on Israeli-linked shipping in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. The Houthis, or Ansar Allah, are attacking ships they suspect of having ties with Israel to pressure Tel Aviv to end the genocide in Gaza. Without any congressional approval, Biden has ordered strikes on Yemen nearly every day since. The attacks have not achieved their desired effects as the Houthis have expanded their targets to include the U.S. and UK linked shipping. Last week, missiles fired from Yemen hit multiple ships off the country's coast. One ship suffered significant damage and is leaking oil. The recent attacks included the use of new weapon systems by the Houthis, including naval drones. The Biden administration official speaking with CNN told the outlet that the war was not having the desired outcome, that the Houthis' military capabilities continue to surprise the White House, and the Pentagon is unaware of the extent of the weapon stockpiles in Yemen. So this is quoting from a senior defense official. They continue to surprise us. We don't have a good idea of what they still have. Multiple officials have revealed that the issue is that Washington does not know the size of the Houthis' arms stockpiles and cannot assess that the hundreds of U.S. bombs dropped on Yemen have had an impact on the Houthis' military abilities. Some administration officials now believe the best way to end the conflict is by ending the war in Gaza, according to CNN. Those officials believe that the Houthis will be faithful to their stated policy that the strikes on shipping will end once the Israeli onslaught in Gaza concludes. And I think those officials are right. Unfortunately, I'm not sure anybody's going to listen to them. All right, all. Thank you so much for tuning into the show today. If you're listening on Monday the 26th here, I will be on with Judge Napolitano at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. That's the only appearance I know I have this week, but I may be on more. I'll try to let you know as that comes up. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Back with more later in the week.